Dear brothers, happy Wednesday, boys. Halfway through the week, I'm almost to moving day. Things are going swimmingly. Sold a bunch of stuff, was great. A couple of absolute oxes came to the house to move a huge couch earlier today. We're in the right direction. Speaking of moving weight, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics today, this morning, that I have conversations with clients about every week, that I have conversations with other clinicians and strength coaches and random people on the internet, pretty much every week. And this is the whimsical world of exercise technique. And does it matter for muscle growth, injury prevention, and effectiveness of your workouts overall? Okay? So, first of all, what is technique? So technique, exercise technique, is simply the physical way in which you perform a certain exercise. In honesty, there's probably multiple ways in which you can perform a singular movement, and so we're probably better off saying that technique is a composition of ways in which you can perform an exercise. And the question comes down to, are there certain techniques of that exercise that are better than others? And this is a super loaded question. It is not black and white, but don't fret. I'm going to try and break it down for you guys today because I think this is one of the biggest difficulties that we see with people is I don't have the right technique, or I don't know if I'm doing this right, and because of that I don't want to do anymore, or I'm going to get hurt. And we're going to move forward today and make sure you guys know what you're doing and get rid of some of the silliness. So first things first, there is no such thing as perfect technique. None. I'll repeat that. No such thing as perfect technique. Just like there's no such thing as perfect posture. Whew, there's a loaded one. I'll have to do a whole podcast on posture because guess what? There's no such thing as a perfect posture. So we are all designed as humans. We're designed similarly, but all of us are different in some capacity. Some of us have longer arms or shorter torsos or irregularly long femurs, or we have smaller hands or barrel chested, or there's, we walk with our feet out slightly versus some people walk a little bit pigeon-toed. The physical differences list between humans is massive. We are not identical creatures. And so from a biomechanical perspective, all of us are going to have ways to do things which are going to be a touch different than someone else. People that have really long femurs, it's really hard for them to stay super upright when they back squat. People with shorter femurs, that's a little bit easier. So not everyone's going to bench or back squat or deadlift the exact same perfectly similar way. There's going to be differences. So, however, even though we know there are differences between people, there are biomechanically more efficient ways to do certain exercises. So I'll give you a simple example. It would behoove the average person, if they are deadlifting, to keep the bar closer to them than to let it get away from their body. Because the further that bar gets away from their body, their center of gravity is moving, and that's going to load tissues a little bit differently. It's not going to optimize you being able to lift heavier with your deadlift. So when I was competing in powerlifting, one of the issues I had was that the bar would get away from my body, and that limited my top end ability to deadlift heavily. And so we had to make a big biomechanical focus on that technique aspect of it so that I could more effectively perform that lift. So the biomechanics of a lift do matter, no doubt about it. So there is technique involved in those things. But the real question for us is, what should we be looking for out of our technique? Obviously, biomechanics play a role, but there's pretty much a big checklist today that I'm going to give to you guys that you guys can come back to look at when you're training. And this is going to cover 90% of what you guys need to know question-wise. If you have other ones, or if you have videos of you lifting and you're like, I don't know if I'm doing this right, drop me a message on Instagram, email me, just send them to me, and I'm happy to take a look at them. But for most of your questions, they're going to get answered with this checklist. So, first part of that list. The most important factor about your technique is, does it stimulate the muscle you want it to? AKA, if you are trying to build enormously beautiful, pristine quadriceps, are you actually getting fatigue in the quadriceps with that exercise? So let's say, for instance, that you're doing back squats, but you're mostly feeling the exercise in your low back and your shoulders are really uncomfortable from trying to hold the bar on your back, and you're just not getting a very good stimulus to your quads because everything else is kind of bothersome. That's a problem. However, let's say you're doing one of my favorites, rear foot elevated split squats, and your quads are singing by the time you are done with that set, and you are considering whether you're even capable of walking. The baby giraffe status has set in because your legs are just jello. Then you have clearly stimulated your quadricep muscle. So first and foremost, is the muscle you are trying to work actually getting fatigue or getting a good burn, as you will say? Are we getting the pump, as Arnold would tell us? Okay, that's number one. Number two, are you feeling more fatigue in the muscle, or are you getting connective tissue or joint fatigue in the joints connective tissue that surrounds that muscle? A very simple example that I have all the time is when I personally bench a little bit wider, my arms are wide, I tend to get some like anterior shoulder joint and bicep tendon pain, versus if I tighten my grip just slightly, I get it more in my chest and in my triceps. So when I'm a little wider, I'm feeling all of this like angry shoulder discomfort. It doesn't feel like I'm actually targeting my chest. And meanwhile, I should be feeling most of this, like we just said in our first checkpoint, in that muscle. So understand something here. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have any sensation in the joints and the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle. But what my point is if you're feeling all of the strain in your elbow only during tricep extensions versus the muscle, that's a problem. You're getting too much of a connective tissue joint owie versus actually getting the burn you're looking for in the muscle. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, are you stable as you are performing the movement? This means, are you able to actually do the exercise with good control throughout? One of the examples I like to use, and again, this is generic for people out there, this doesn't apply to every exercise, but for most people it does. Can you stop at any given point during the movement? Especially the eccentric portion, which we'll get to in a little bit. But when we talk about being stable, if you're squatting and I say stop, you should be able to stop. If you're benching and I say stop, you should be able to stop. Now, obviously, we don't want to necessarily do that if it's a bunch of weight on the bar, but my point is that you should be stable enough that you're not having to counteract going too quickly. If you're doing repetitions and you're flailing everywhere, you're not going to get a good response to that muscle, or as good of a response as we want. Are you getting something? Sure. Is it the best? No. I've seen guys in the gym doing billions of shortened reps and it looks like they're having a seizure half the time. And again, they might be getting something out of it, but it's not maximizing optimal muscle potential. So understand something is that this also goes, this is a rabbit hole. I'm not going to go down it. I want to, but I won't. When it comes to stability, this goes for doing anything on an uneven surface. I know you guys understand that, but you simply cannot produce as much force on a Bosu ball, that terrible thing, or a foam pad, as you can on a good, natural, hard floor or on something like a bench. You are limiting your body's ability to express force and get a good stimulus to the muscle when you are using those implements. I'm telling you, if you are balancing on a Bosu ball and trying to do curls or overhead press, you are not improving your balance. You're improving your ability to stand on a Bosu ball. And you can't produce as much force with your shoulders, so we're not getting a good enough stimulus to them, and thus you should just stand on the floor because you want your shoulders and deltoids to look beautiful, and just get rid of the Bosu ball. I'll stop the rant. So that's number three. Make sure you are stable. Number four, does the technique you are using open you up to injury? So here's our first conversation about injury. So AKA, are you doing something that has a very high or a higher than likely chance of something going awry? Examples would be you are trying to use too many implements. Here comes that Bosu ball again. You're balancing on a Bosu ball and doing banded rows or doing it single-legged. nonsense like that. So using too many things at a given time. Or you're trying to squat or do a bench press and you don't have a spotter, or you're doing a bunch of weight that you, back squat's a great example. So say you're back squatting and you put a bunch of weight on the bar and you squat to the bottom and you go to stand up and you're like, I've never bailed out before. Obviously, if you've never been taught how to bail out of a back squat and you don't have racks there to stop that, that's not very smart. That's likely to lead to injury. So that technique really isn't ideal. That's really a loading question. But again, if you're doing something and you're like, this seems kind of stupid, well, then don't do that. I've seen people that are hanging upside down doing curls. The chances are that's probably going to harm you, and it's stupid. I don't even think, it doesn't even look cool. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. So I can tell you something with certainty, though, that most people believe that their technique is the reason, sole reason that they got injured. They squatted too low and they had a butt wink, which is also a non-entity. And they think that that's the reason that they had an issue. And do not get it twisted. That does play a role. Your technique does play a role. If you're, I'll use deadlifting again. If you're deadlifting and the bar gets way far away from you, yes, that's going to put more strain through your erector muscles in your low back. It would make sense if you maybe had a strain from doing that, or you're doing dumbbell RDLs or barbell RDLs and you get a little more depth than normal, or maybe you're really fatigued. Aha, that is the key question. So most of the time, what I see is that when people are trying to do something with more weight or with more overall volume, more reps, more sets, than they are capable of tolerating at that given time, the body can break down in some form or fashion. This could be as simple as they didn't get a phenomenal night's sleep the last couple of days. Maybe they've got a brand new baby and they go in and they train hard and they put the normal weight on and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm just so fatigued. And voila, something goes awry. That can happen. Maybe you added a little more weight or you did a few more repetitions. Fatigue plays a huge role. Example being, it's not necessarily that they did the chest press wrong. It's simply that they had too much weight on the bar or they did way too many repetitions. Obviously, technique is going to play a role in injury, but load management is a far more important factor that I address with myself and with my clients than their overall technique. Because technique is a quick, we can adjust, make little tweaks here and there. It's the load that ends up getting people in trouble. That's number 4. I'll try to keep it short. 5. Big one right here. Are you using a full range of motion, or are you doing cheater reps, or, and to that end, are you doing full range of motion or are you cheating? And are you focusing on controlling the eccentric portion of the lift? So if you want muscle growth, you unequivocally need to be training in the fullest range of motion that the muscle has. AKA, if I'm doing bicep curls, the arm should fully extend all the way down each and every time you do the movement. And in the same breath, you should also not be doing cheater or half or partial reps for the full movement. Usually, this means the weight is too heavy for your level of strength. Easy as that. And you're going to utilize other muscles to help perform the movement. And this is not benefiting the target muscle. All of you have been in the gym watching people do bicep curls and they're just heaving them backward. They're basically doing a back extension with the weight in their hands. And although they feel like their biceps are doing it, their glutes and their back are doing half of the work. So that's that. Additionally, if you want more muscle growth, this is what the data shows. This isn't my idea. I didn't come up with this. It's just what our research says. You have got to focus on the eccentric or downward portion of the bicep curl. The place that we see the most growth occurring is actually at the full extended motion and in the beginning of that movement. That's when we're seeing a ton of growth happening. And so if you're missing that, or you're not controlling the eccentric portion of the lift, which we know increases your muscle growth, you're wasting time. That's you doing things just too quickly for giggles. Speaking of an injury perspective, very, very, very few people are going to hurt themselves if they are doing a slow and controlled bicep curl or pull-up or squat. But those who are doing severely rapid motions, which your body's just not attuned to doing, are far more likely to have an injury pop up, okay? Fast eccentrics, don't get me wrong, there is a place for those, but that's not necessarily for the average guy. We might use those things with certain plyometric movements, with athletes that we're working on quick eccentrics. That's one thing, getting a certain kind of a stretch that we're looking for that helps optimize force production. Those things exist, but for the average person that's just trying to look muscular as hell, they are probably not going to be on the menu for doing super fast eccentrics, okay? That's number 5. Number 6, it is okay to change up a technique of your hands or of your feet or what have you based on how you do the movement. So let me give you an example. When I do chest flies, I do not get this huge big stretch at the bottom of my chest fly because it tends to, again, similar to bench press, it bothers my anterior shoulder and my bicep tendon way more. Instead, I actually make the focus, I put my hands a little lower, or I elevate the seat with a chest fly if I'm doing it with a machine. Or if I'm on my back doing flies, I focus far, far more on squeezing my hands together at the top of the movement. I feel a huge pump in my chest when I do this, far more than when I allow my arms to go way further back. And again, that's just an adjustment of the technique. So if I watch a video of a guy who's like, oh no, you've got to get this huge big stretch, and I do it, and I'm like, man, that's really bugging my shoulder. That's not an effective technique for me because, again, it violates rule number 1, which is the target muscle being stimulated? If you are doing something with a certain form but not feeling it, make some little changes to your technique or add in some equipment. I'll give you another great example that I love in terms of adding equipment. If you are someone like my wife, whose legs are far too strong to perform dumbbell RDLs without using wrist wraps. She has very, very strong hamstrings and glutes, but she can't hold heavier dumbbells. So the weight keeps slipping out of her hands. So instead of that, we give her wraps. She puts wraps around them. She can have a heavier weight in her hand, and thus we are actually able to get a better stimulus to her legs without struggling of dropping the weight, on the ground or on her toes. Makes total sense. So it's okay to have to use accessories for those things. Belts is another accessory that you can use. I'll have to do a whole podcast on that. But again, if that makes you feel more stable and it feels like you're able to do a movement better, beautiful. Piece of cake. If you're using wraps, that's totally fine. If wrist wraps makes your wrist feel more stable and you can bench better when you do that or press better when you do that, so be it. Chalk. There's nothing wrong with chalk. If your hands get really slippery, throw some chalk on your hands. Lord willing, your gym allows such things. It's okay to use accessories like that to do certain movements. Okay, the moral of the story is this, fellas. If you are getting a good stimulus to the target muscle without getting a bunch of fatigue in the joints and connective tissue that surrounds it, and you are doing this with a mostly full and realistic range of motion, and loading the muscle enough without ungodly amounts of systemic fatigue, your technique is probably beautiful. That doesn't mean that little tweaks cannot be made like I've talked about before. I tell clients constantly to make adjustments after watching their videos. They send them in, I go, you know what? Maybe I want you to toe out just slightly. I want the bar a little bit lower on your back. Hey, with your bench, I want you to go a touch wider and actually bring your elbows in just a little bit. Hey, with your push-ups, let your hands go out just a touch. Let's just see how that feels. Hey, with your lunges, it just looks like you're maybe letting that foot get a little too wide. Tighten that up. They're little things. They're just tweaks. And so let me give you another great example that I just looked at in my notes. I have some people who do far better with seated rows rather than doing dumbbell rows in terms of feeling their upper back or getting stimulation in their upper back. So we just don't do dumbbell rows as much. So from a technique perspective, they can do both effectively, but one of them gives us a better stimulus. So that's just the one that we put into their programming more often. So understand something, guys. We want to optimize our time in the gym. Technique plays a role in that, but people far, far, far too much overhype it. When they focus so hard on their technique, they tend to underload themselves, and this is problematic because we're not getting a good enough response, a good enough stimulus, and they're becoming more and more nervous about performing anything with load because they're afraid they're going to do it wrong and get hurt, and that can happen. But this is not the mindset that we want. We have to load our tissues in order to see progress. It has to be done with full or mostly full range of motion. We have to feel it in the target muscle. We then have to repeat this with higher weight or with more volume. And then we reassess and we keep going. Whew. Okay, that was super long-winded. I'm gonna leave it at that. Go through that checklist, make sure you understand it. If you have questions, let me know. I'll be sure to post that whole checklist to the socials so you guys can see it. But if you have questions or if you have videos you want me to take a look at, drop them down. I love you all. Easy as that. God bless, be strong. Let's get freaking strong and swole today, boys. God bless, we'll see you fellas.